first off, congratulations on your master's. As a PhD student, I'm like, wow, okay, that's great. Like, finishing your degree must feel so good. And also, you did your degree in genome sequencing?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. And it's such an interesting field with so many different pathways. And to top it off, during your degree, you also co-founded the Toronto Science Policy Network. Why don't you let our audience know what that experience was like and also the importance and relevance of policy during your master's?
Mhm. So when I started my master's, I had no idea anything about science policy. It wasn't a word that I knew. When I was doing my master's, I was carrying out DNA sequencing. So I was kind of curious about how changes in our DNA can cause different neurological disorders. But as I kind of kept exploring my field and just learning more and more in graduate school, I kind of noticed some common problems that kept popping up. So there's this idea that there's underrepresentation of different communities in the STEM fields, that a lot of science is actually inaccessible due to jargon or just being locked behind paywalls. So as I learned more and more about these issues, I wanted to do something to address them. And one of the ways I learned how was through science policy. So I co-founded the Toronto Science Policy Network with 4 other amazing graduate students at the University of Toronto, where we really wanted to provide a platform for students, researchers, and local community to learn about and engage in science policy. And that's how I learned more too. I attended a lot of Canadian science policy conferences over the last few years, meeting and speaking to other people and just learning a lot more about what's happening all over Canada. And through that, I began to learn how science plays a role in decision making and how even in genomics, there's a lot of different issues at play. So I actually ended up being a teaching assistant for a course about the ethical and legal implications of medical genomics. So I guess throughout my master's, I defended my degree during the pandemic, but I also learned a lot about kind of how science has a relationship with policy and politics. And regardless of which field you're in, there are policy issues that you want to consider and start thinking about as you're doing the research day to day.
Wow, I really identify with that because until I entered the volunteer realm of CSPC, I actually wasn't very familiar with science policy. And then once attending this conference, the amount of avenues that policy applies to within research, you're completely correct. There's so many opportunities for it to apply. And could you just give us a little detail about some of the policies that you saw were needed in your field?
Mhm. So, for example, one big issue in genomics is that there isn't a lot of diversity. So, everything that is sequenced when it comes to the human genome, it's always mapped to the reference genome. So, this genome is kind of the map that we map all other sequences to. But if that reference genome isn't diverse, if it only represents white individuals, that's not really going to work for other populations. So, if the basis of all of our genomics work is flawed and not representative of the world, it kind of places all future work at that same disadvantage too. So that's one huge problem. And there are scientists and groups who are working across the world trying to make sure that we're building a more diverse and representative reference genome.
Wow, thank you for clarifying. That issue is something that maybe wouldn't have popped into many Canadians' their minds when they do go to the doctor and have these tests done. I myself wouldn't have thought of that. That's really important. Thank you for bringing that up. And well, now that you're done your master's and you've been selected to be one of the 20 youth advisors for Canada's Chief Science Advisor, can you describe what you hope to contribute to this team?
Mhm. I mean, the first thing that I realized when this council was announced was over 1,000 people applied to the council and only 20 were selected. So I'm very aware of the responsibility that this role involves. So our role as the Youth Council is to advise the Canada's Chief Science Advisor, so Dr. Mona Niemer, on the perspectives of Canada's youth community and kind of the issues and challenges that we're facing, whether it's an undergraduate student, a graduate student, or a postdoctoral fellow. So what I'm really hoping to bring is kind of my skills, my expertise, my experience to the table, and to also ensure that I'm representing the voices. So whether it's speaking to people through one-on-one conversations or holding a session at the Canadian Science Policy Conference, I'm really hoping that we can really represent the challenges that students and individuals all across this country are facing and make sure that those concerns are being heard by Dr. Mona Nemer and the federal funding agencies so that we can help make a change.
I see. So your goal is to use this platform to not only amplify with your previous experiences with policy and inclusion work, but bringing that into this new position. That's really great. So I guess a good follow-up question would be, what is the impact of the youth councils so far on your own views in Canadian science policy?
So the Youth Council consists of 20 other scientists, and they're from all over Canada and from so many different fields. And I've learned a lot from just my fellow members. We also have 3 incredible mentors. That's Paul Dufour, Rakeb Tesfaye, and Shelley Weird. So just with everyone, we have really great discussions, and it's really helping us kind of think of more things as we pursue projects. For example, there is a council member called Justina Mendelia, and she's actually been looking at plastic pollution during COVID-19. So all the masks and the PPE that we're wearing, where is that debris going? And that's not something I thought about. Like, I know that everyone's wearing masks, but I wasn't thinking about the littering aspect of it. So every day I'm learning something new. And honestly, having a big team means that you get to hear a lot of different perspectives, and that really informs what we're doing.
That's really great. I'm glad to hear that the big team is kind of a reflection of all Canadians. So it's a really amount of like diverse views. And the COVID-19 question is super relevant. So this is kind of a side question, but are you guys updating your policy work as the situation continues? Are you guys able to kind of modify your roles as with current issues that we're facing today?
So fun fact, the council was announced in March 2020, just about a week or so before the pandemic really locked out. So our entire reality has been the pandemic. I have not seen my fellow council members in person, which is really sad, but it also means that everything we're doing, we have the pandemic in mind. For example, during Science Literacy Week, which was, I think, middle of September, but what is time? We hosted discussions with youth across Canada. We wanted to hear how undergraduate and graduate students were feeling as they went back to school. What were the concerns they had? So from those discussions, we heard concerns and we've relayed those back to the chief science advisor. So COVID-19 is very on top of our minds. It's affecting how we're operating as a council, but it's something that we keep in mind with every action we take. And we're really trying our best here to kind of keep identifying the challenges and keep thinking of recommendations and actions that can help mitigate the pandemic's impact on all of Canada's youth science community.
Wow. Well, just from that, I can tell that your role and the roles of your colleagues is going to be really important as time goes on, because as a student with the changing situation, our faculties and our supervisors updating us, they're doing the best that they can, everyone is. And it seems as though our concerns being amplified by your group as well is just great to hear. And kind of a side note now. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say that it's not just short-term impacts, right? Like, these impacts are going to be felt in the years to come, and it might even affect the competitiveness of Canadian graduate students and researchers in the future. So this really is a big issue. And it's not just for the Youth Council. Like, I would also ask for other scientists and supervisors, like, this is something that's going to affect us all. And we all have to step up for young scientists right now.
Yep, everyone right now, myself included, has had to modify their thesis. We've had special meetings. It's something that I'm sure when you guys just started in March, wow, the impact is grand, that's for sure. And now, speaking of something slightly along the same path of science communication, but something that's more of a creative project for yourself, we were researching, and you're also a prominent storyteller. And it sounds like a lovely combination of creativity and communication. And can you tell us a bit about that, but also where we can find your short stories?
So I really enjoy telling stories about science and scientists. It actually started in my undergraduate degree, where I was writing for my school campus newspaper. and I ended up being the editor of our features section. But I kind of changed the features section into having a very strong focus on science. But no one complained, which was awesome. And by the end of my degree, when I started graduate studies, I decided I wanted to do more about telling science stories. So I just kept writing.
Mhm.
And I usually focus on kind of my expertise of genetics and genomics. But these days, especially with the pandemic, I'm thinking more about kind of how science intersects with policy and society. So usually I am writing for outlets like Forbes, Massive Science, for Signals, but I'm always open for a challenge. I recently wrote a story about a survey that's actually showing that science skepticism has declined in the last for the
Mhm.
first time in the last 3 years as a result of the pandemic, because science is at the forefront of everyone's minds. So it's always just fun, like learning these new studies, facts, and just saying, this is cool. And this is something that I think people would be interested in. So I kind of do let my curiosity drive me. And hopefully that resonates with everyone. But yeah, it's always fun to kind of explore different topics with science writing.
That's really great. And do you publish these on your personal website by chance, or do you have like a another platform that you use?
Sure. I mean, I do link everything on my website, so farahqaiser.com, but it can end up anywhere. Yeah.
That's awesome. I'm glad that it's accessible because I'm sure, like myself, people viewing this interview maybe might wander over and see that there's a chance to integrate not only your sciencey background, but also if you're enjoying writing in your free time. Yeah, that's awesome. And our last question today, it's been an absolute honor to have the Chief Science Advisors Youth Council Roundtable at CSPC this year. But without telling us too much about the upcoming roundtable, can you describe the impact of the pandemic, which you've kind of alluded to before in this interview? So the impact of the pandemic on Canadian science policy and the importance of the youth perspective as we return post-pandemic.
Mhm. So COVID-19 has really impacted all members of Canada's science community, but it's, as we've mentioned a few times, it's especially impacting trainees and young early career researchers.
Mhm.
So making sure that the perspectives of this demographic are represented as we start thinking about how we can build back better our science community is going to be especially vital. And as we kind of just see from the 1,000 applications for the Youth Council, like there are people in Canada who are interested in having their voices heard, but there are very few opportunities for the youth to take part. So that's one of the ideas behind our session. We're hosting 5 different conversations in our session at the Canadian Science Policy Conference. It includes the impact of COVID-19 on research, representation in STEM, and kind of the cost of pursuing a science career and the road to science policy. So we're very interested in getting the opinions and thoughts of Canada's youth science community. So whether you're an undergraduate student, a graduate student, postdoctoral fellow, you're all welcome. And we're really looking forward to learning from everyone and kind of identifying what are the next steps that we can take as a youth council to represent what Canada's youth is thinking and kind of moving forward to empowering trainees as they become researchers, science writers, policymakers, whichever career they choose.
Well, I'm so glad that we had this conversation because as a student and as a research trainee, it is very reassuring to hear that Canada's Youth Advisory Council and Dr. Mona Nemer are communicating about the things that are really impacting the youth and that our perspective post COVID-19 is very relevant. So I hope these conversations become more accessible, and I'm sure that many graduate students would love to contribute to them some suggestions or anything like that. But Farah, thank you so much for your time today with CSPC, and we really look forward to seeing you at the roundtable coming up in this conference. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me.